My name is no longer important. Once I wore the white collar and the black cloth and believed that obedience was a kind of light. Once I thought silence was sacred, that it guarded truth the way walls guard a garden at night. I was wrong. Silence was not sacred. It was enforced. And the garden I believed in was only a hedge surrounding a pit. I speak now because I cannot carry this into the grave. Beneath the holy city there is another city, a city without sky, a city stitched from staircases and wounds. They call it rumor, metaphor, the fever dream of apostates. I tell you this as one who walked its arteries. The labyrinth under the Vatican is stone and blood and memory carved into the earth, and once you descend, you are never the same again. I was 24 when the labyrinth first counted me. I remember the draft in my cell, the cracked window that coughed Rome's winter into my bones, the lamp that hummed like a tired bee. I had been ordained only months, holy oil not yet dry in the lines of my hands. That evening, a scrap of parchment slid under my door without knock or seal. 4 lines, nothing more. Fast for 3 days. Remain in prayer. Await the summons. Speak of this to no one. The letters were neat and arid, as if written by a clerk who had forgotten his own name. I read the lines again and again, then pressed the parchment to my lips like a relic and tried not to tremble. Hunger makes the mind faithful. On the first day I felt pious. On the second I felt clean. On the third I felt hollowed, as if my ribs were the fingers of a great hand squeezing me gently to see what secrets would come out. At vespers on that third day, the door opened and a Monsignor entered, tall and thin, his eyes the color of extinguished glass. He held a single candle already burning. He did not greet me with words or blessings. He simply placed the candle in my hand and said, "Follow," as if the command had been echoing for centuries, and I had merely stepped into its path. We walked against the flow of the living city. The corridors narrowed, then forgot their frescoes, then forgot their plaster, then forgot that corridors were meant for men at all. The world shed its ornaments like a snake shedding skins. Incense became dust. Warmth became the exhalation of stone. We passed a door I had never seen, its hinges black with age. Beyond it lay the stairwell. It was not a staircase built by architects who draw lines and speak of load and span. It was hewn downward, step by stubborn step, as if time had gnawed its way into the rock. Each tread was damp and shallow. The air that rose from below had weight. It smelt of iron and the parchment of dead centuries. I asked softly, to keep my voice from sounding like a trespass, how far the stairs went. The Monsignor said, "The labyrinth counts you, not the other way around." His breath made the candle wick bow as if in prayer. I thought of the stories they tell novices to frighten them into humility. 99 steps for the pure, 113 for the unsure, numbers that change according to the sins you bring with you. I tried to count, but the numbers slipped off the edges of my thoughts like rain sliding off slate. At the bottom stood an iron door, not merely old but elder, lacquered in the kind of darkness that looks like sleep but is only vigilance. Symbols were cut into it, angular wounds in metal, strokes that were not Latin nor Greek nor Hebrew nor any letter I had married my eyes to in seminary. When the candlelight stroked them, they seemed to hum without sound, like strings plucked in a room that forbids music. I asked what they meant. The Monsignor raised one finger to his lips and whispered, "Do not give them your voice." For years I wondered whether he meant the letters themselves or the men who taught the letters to obey. 3 other priests' faces I never saw again put their palms to the door and pushed. No bolt withdrew, no key clicked. The door moved because a ritual had been fed to it. The weight of their bodies was merely the spoon. When the gap opened, the darkness behind it breathed out, a stale metallic gust, laced with the sweetness of old ink and the penny taste of blood. The flames shivered. The Monsignor stepped through, as if stepping into the mouth of a patient whose disease he already knew. Inside was not a cellar. It was a geography. Corridors shouldered away from one another like quarrelsome brothers. Vaulted ceilings climbed above the reach of light. Alcoves opened like mouths that had forgotten language. From iron hooks hung chained books, their leather dried the color of scabs. Statues peered from niches with faces rubbed blank by purposeful hands. The walls were sweating. Every drop carried a reflection like a tiny, shivering mirror. Somewhere water ticked, a patient metronome beating out a time not meant for the world above. I understood nothing, and yet a sentence, not my own, folded itself inside my chest. History is not kept here. It is buried alive. The Monsignor did not teach. He guided each turn of his wrist a quiet denial of any other path. My candle no longer felt like a tool. It felt like permission. The first chamber they showed me was called the antechamber of dust, though none spoke its name aloud. Shelves shouldered upward until they met darkness. Chained books swayed, although no air moved. I read the scorched titles, most of them half-shadows. The Gospel of the Twin, the Memory of Magdalene, the Book of the Stars. I had met these names before, as slanders whispered by teachers who smile sadly when they speak of error. Above ground they were rumors. Here they dangled like prisoners, their ankles ironed to the beam. I extended a hand only to taste iron on my wrist where the Monsignor's grip closed. "Not yours to touch," he said. "Not yours to question." His eyes were not cruel. They were tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. Beyond the antechamber, we passed through a corridor whose walls were not stone but polished black glass. In them I saw reflections that were not mine. A soldier with crimson on his sword, a veiled woman cradling a child whose gaze was ancient as basalt, a priest lighting a fire with both hands while tears silvered his face. They walked beside me in the mirror but did not match my steps. When I turned my head, they were gone. When I looked forward, they were already waiting. The labyrinth remembers what men are forced to forget, the Monsignor whispered. The sentence clung to me like wet cloth. We emerged into a circular room whose floor was a ring of stone around a mouth of darkness. 12 marble chairs faced the pit. On the backs of the chairs names were carved, some familiar from catechisms, some as strange as a language one only dreams in. The letters of certain names had been scratched out with a violence that still shone. Others were layered, one over another like palimpsests of authority. I asked who those unknown popes were. The Monsignor showed me the profile of his face, which is to say, he showed me silence. The pit breathed cold. The candlelight slid toward its lip and refused to go further. From below came not a draught, but an absence, a presence shaped like the place where breath should be. I leaned closer and heard a whisper that reminded me of my own name. The way a raven's call can sometimes sound like a word. They did not take me deeper that night. The living are not meant for the deepest levels. That is what I was told later, in the sort of tone one uses to reassure a patient he will not feel pain. I returned to my cell with the labyrinth stitched into the lining of my thoughts. Prayer felt like speaking to a door that had been politely locked. I slept and woke and slept again without knowing whether dawn had bothered to come. Summons multiplied. Weeks turned into a rope that lowered me knot by knot. I was shown the cartography room where maps were stored under skins of oiled cloth. Some displayed coastlines that supposedly no man had seen then. Others depicted cities that, if the chronicles were to be trusted, had never existed at all. The inked lines were too confident to be guesses. I learned not to ask who drew them. Another room held calendars like ribs hung to dry, Julian bones, Gregorian bones, and other bones with no names at all. On some, centuries were missing, little square windows of time neatly excised with a knife that had learned patience from God. Elsewhere, scraps of years were sewn together like mismatched cloth, the seams stitched in red. My stomach taught my knees a new choreography. Bend, rise, bend, rise. Why? I asked once, my voice thin as paper. Because remembering is a weapon, said a voice behind me. I turned and saw a guard whose mouth was a scar. He wrote with a fingertip in the dust on the shelf. To remember is to betray. To forget is to serve. There were reliquaries full of nothing but ash, reliquaries with slivers of bone inscribed like scrolls, reliquaries that held only a single hair tied into a knot I could not follow with my eyes. I saw skulls tattooed with star maps, mandibles packed with rolled vellum like tobacco, finger bones drilled through and threaded with rosaries made from alphabetic beads that spelled names I had never heard in any litany. The saints had become cabinets. Holiness had become storage space. One evening, I was led to a room that had the shape of a question. It contained a long table and chairs on both sides like the spine of a fish. A priest sat at each place with an inkpot before him. Instead of pens, there were needles. The parchment at the center of the table was wide as a sail. The Monsignor stood me at the head and said, "Confession of silence." The words made a coldness creep along my gums. I watched as the priests pricked their fingers and signed not with their names but with the shapes of their names. Ink bled into blood, blood into ink, until letter and vein were indistinguishable. Above them hung a lantern with no flame, and yet light gathered within it like breath gathered in a chest. When my turn came, I could not feel the pen, only the tremor of the thing inside me that did not want to be written. The needle kissed my skin, and I pressed my name onto the page, and felt a portion of myself evacuate quietly, as if dismissed from duty. After, a door opened that I had not seen. Through it, I glimpsed a small chamber whose walls were covered in mirrors from floor to dome. In each mirror I saw myself altered, older, younger, with eyes that were not mine, tongueless, crowned, shackled, veiled, laughing, weeping, blind. Some versions carried a torch, some carried a knife. Some carried nothing but a silence so heavy I could feel it through glass. The Monsignor said, "Possibility is a kind of heresy. We keep it here." I watched one reflection turn its head a fraction after I turned mine, as if struggling with the delay of a distant transmission. When I lifted the candle, a few versions of me lifted theirs and the rest stood dark. And that was the worst part, because I understood at last that not all of me had been brought to this room. There were corridors paved with uneven tiles shaped like tongues, all pointing the same direction, as if the ground itself were learning to swallow. There were doors painted with ochre fingerprints pressed there by hands now dust. There were walls inked with diagrams of churches that were never built and prisons that were. In one niche lay a stack of parchments bound with a belt buckle hammered into the shape of a key. Its strap was still warm, though no hand had touched it in my lifetime. I do not know how I knew that, only that the knowledge had the temperature of breath. I was shown the vault of chained homilies, where sermons that had never been preached were kept locked like wolves. The titles were precise as surgeons' marks, on the errors of the calendar and the mercy of correction, against the worship of the map, in praise of the holy forgetting. Each had marginal notes written in 3 hands: the authors, the censors, the man who taught both how to hold their pens. I read one line I have never entirely forgotten, though I have tried. If the flock remembers its own path through the field, the fence becomes a suggestion. The censor's note beside it said simply, "Unfit for ears." The third hand had underlined the sentence twice, and drawn a small eye beside it that seemed to watch me even when I closed the book. On one descent, the Monsignor stopped at a grate that shivered with cold. Behind it, a stair spiraled further down, a screw driven into something that did not wish to be held. "Below," he said, "is not for us." I asked what us meant. He did not answer. The grate was locked, with a mechanism shaped like a flower, petals of iron that would only open to a key I had never seen and a password I did not possess. Yet from the darkness below came a slow pulse, like the sea hearing itself think. I stepped closer, and the air tasted metallic, as if a vast instrument were being tuned in the dark. I began to measure time not by bells but by the rate at which memories altered their temperature. Some cooled and could be held long without pain. Others burned whenever I reached for them. I found myself forgetting the faces of friends, while remembering the weight of doors I had only brushed with my fingertips. I would wake at night with the certainty that my name had been filed somewhere, cross-referenced under the categories of obedience and fracture. During Mass, my voice sometimes faltered on familiar syllables, as if words were stones I had to push uphill. I learned to steady myself by counting other people's breaths. They let me sit once in the circular chamber with the 12 marble chairs and the terrible pit. No one else was present. I sat where I imagined men had sat before the idea of me was even language. On the chair back behind my shoulder, the carved name had been chiseled away but not polished. The scars were raw as a heart after surgery. The seat was cold and trembled, as if remembering the weight of a stranger. I leaned forward until my knees kissed the lip of the pit and whispered my own name, then someone else's, then another. The dark returned nothing, no echo, no contempt, only that patient cold. I understood that the pit did not answer. It listened. I understood that the pit had time. Another day they put a book in my hands and told me to copy. The leather cover cracked like a knuckle. The text was written in characters that made my eyes feel as if they were standing on a moving deck. I traced each sign the way a man traces the face of a lover he is meeting again after many years, by memory, not by sight. It took hours to copy a page. My hand cramped in shapes it had not practiced before. Sometimes when I glanced down at my own lines, I saw that I had written not ink, but a pale dust that dispersed when I breathed. The Monsignor did not scold. "Some texts prefer to be remembered without words," he said. "Write anyway." There were guards who had no tongues. There were guards whose mouths were intact, but who had chosen never to use them again. One of them, a man with beautiful hands and eyes like brackish water, taught me how to listen for footsteps inside stone. "Walls keep secrets," he scratched on a slate. "Floors keep habits." He ran his palms over the flagstones, as if feeling for a pulse. "When a corridor has been used to carry fear, It goes hollow. You can hear it. He thumped the floor. A drum of absence sounded back. Once, only once, I witnessed a ritual no one had prepared me for. In a chamber shaped like a chalice stood a group of men in dark vestments that did not correspond to any order I knew. On the floor between them was a circle painted with gold leaf and dusted with ash. In the center of the circle lay a book locked with 3 clasps shaped like wings. The air smelt of cardamom and old steel. A thin ladle of light poured through a slot in the ceiling and found the book wherever it was moved, as if trained. The men hummed without melody, a note that made my jaw ache. The Monsignor placed me at the threshold. "Observe," he said, "and later remember to forget." One of the men pricked his thumb and let the blood fall on the clasps. Another breathed upon them. A third whispered a sentence that had no vowels. The wings opened. The pages within were not parchment, but a material I can only describe as cured shadow. Writing appeared when a hand hovered and faded, when the hand retreated. When the pages were turned, they made no sound. They gave off a small draught, like the exhale of a bird. The men read with their eyes half closed, as if not wanting to see too much of what they were reading. Then the humming ceased. The book shut itself. The light retracted into the ceiling like a careful animal. The men left without acknowledging me. My candle forgot to flicker. For a long time I stood there listening for the aftertaste of meaning. I asked the Monsignor, days later when courage had borrowed my mouth, what order those men belonged to. "To a very old one," he said. "Older than uniforms, younger than fear." He looked past me toward a point over my shoulder where perhaps a different version of his life was standing. "You were not brought here to join them," he added. "You were brought here to carry weight." I did not ask what weight. My spine knew. The labyrinth began to follow me upward. In the refectory, the clatter of cutlery sounded like chains easing through a ring. In the library, the softer pages hissed like something being shushed. I found dust under my nails that did not resemble dust from the world, grains shaped like the fragments of letters. I dreamed of a staircase turned sideways so that I had to crawl along the wall to descend, and every time I reached for the next stair, it slipped away to become a word I could not pronounce. I woke with my pillow damp where my mouth had been open trying to speak. On a morning of spring, I stood in the square and watched doves blur the sky above the obelisk. Tourists lifted cameras. The shutters stitched the moment like a wound that wanted to be remembered. I felt a grief so sudden and so wide that I nearly dropped to my knees. It was not grief for a person, but for a possibility. The world has always been larger than its stories. I had believed that, but I had not understood how ferociously the stories worked to make the world smaller again. I could no longer tell whether I was grieving for the world or for the stories. I tried to confess to a confessor who did not know what he was hearing. I tried to put into the architecture of catechism a shape that had no roof. I spoke of obedience and was given absolution. I spoke of fear and was given prayer. I spoke of silence and was given silence. I left the booth with a lighter heart and a heavier tongue. There is a moment in every descent when the feet begin to think for themselves. Another step, they say, and another. It is easier to go on than to turn back, and in that arithmetic there is a terrible economy. I remember standing again before the iron door and placing my palm on the cold that had memorized other palms. I remember thinking how many of us were alive because we had agreed to act as if we were dead. When the door opened that time, the gust smelled almost sweet, as though rot had learned courtesy. I returned to the antechamber of dust, and stood beneath the chained books. Some of them looked lighter, as if they had been fed. The whisper of their pages was like the brushing of moth wings in a coat. "If the gospel is good news," I said aloud before I knew I had spoken, "what are these?" No one answered. But something in the rafters shifted its weight the way an audience adjusts itself before a performance begins. "Do not try to make theology out of it," the Monsignor said later, when we were passing a wall on which the plans for a cathedral had been drawn in soot and then effaced with milk. "Theology requires air." He placed his hand flat against the stone. "Here we are, beneath the breath line." "What is all this for?" I asked. The question felt like a blade I had carried too long in my pocket. "For continuity," he said. "For mercy, for order, for terror." He listed the words as if counting the beads of a rosary no one else could see. "For memory," he added at last. "Especially for memory." It was then that I understood the clearest thing I have ever understood. Memory was not something the church kept. It was something the church farmed, plowed, seeded, pruned, harvested, burned, and I was a field that had been requisitioned. I lasted years. I performed sacraments. I laughed with brothers in cloisters where sunlight made the dust look like gold forgiving itself. I wrote letters to my mother and did not send them. I ate bread and tasted the texture of old paper. Sometimes I told myself I had imagined the worst of it. Sometimes I told myself I had imagined none of it, and that imagination was the only solvent capable of holding my shape. In time I learned to climb the stairs without counting and to let the iron door open without feeling gratitude. I learned to copy in a hand that looked like mine but belonged to another alphabet. I learned where to stand in the circular room, so that the pit did not make my lungs remember how small breaths could be. I learned the schedules of men who had replaced speech with the clarity of gesture. I learned to sleep with my back against a wall, even when the world above was clean. I learned many things a man can learn in order not to die too soon. Tonight I am done learning. Tonight I choose to say what my body has been saying in other dialects for years. I choose to let the story resume its natural size. If this confession condemns me, then let condemnation be another word for waking. Understand, I do not tell you this to make you afraid. Fear is one of their rooms, and I will not usher you into it. I tell you this because the most dangerous thing for them is not our anger or our heresies or our mistakes. The most dangerous thing is when memory returns. The labyrinth beneath the Vatican is not a metaphor, not a fevered anecdote, not a tourist's invention. It is there, a city under a city, a machinery under a music, a book that writes the hand that writes it. It is stone and blood and memory carved into the earth. It is history kept awake with its mouth covered, and once you descend, once you feel the stairs count, you and the iron door breathe, and the darkness learn your name. You are never the same again. They called it the Forbidden Archives, only when they were certain the stones could not overhear them. To our faces, to our files, it was given other names: rooms of special custody, the lower repository, the annex of non-circulating texts, labels as bland as hospital food, meant to suggest that what lived there was merely inconvenient to shelve. But I will tell you what really lived there. Books that remembered the hands that burned them, maps that knew the shape of coastlines, no one was permitted to name. Calendars that coughed up centuries, like phlegm of the past. Testimonies that survived by learning how to make their ink look tired. If Chapter 1 was my descent, Chapter 2 is the room where descent learned letters. The first time they let me enter as more than a passerby, the Monsignor stopped me at the threshold and rested his palm on my chest, as if weighing my breath. "Do not strain your eyes," he said. The archives strain back. I nodded like a novice who still believes obedience is the quickest road between 2 points. In truth, I had no road left, only corridors. The chamber had the hush of snowfall without the mercy of snow. Shelves grew from the floor like trees that had learned geometry. Chains hung from iron rails, not to keep thieves at bay, but to remind the books what betrayal felt like. Every third shelf carried a shallow drawer, and every drawer contained a set of calfskin gloves that had been washed so often they remembered other hands better than they remembered their own seams. On a central table lay a ledger the size of a tombstone. Its title was stamped in blind, Catalogus Emendationum, the Catalogue of Corrections. To correct, in that room, did not mean to make right. It meant to make fit. A woman stood at the table, black veil without order, sleeves rolled to the elbow as if truth were a field to be harvested. Her face was plain, in the way a blade is plain. When she lifted her eyes, I felt weighed like a volume being assigned a call number. "Custos," the Monsignor said, with a respect that did not reach his posture. "The new one." She considered me, then drew a horizontal line across the ledger with a quill that had clearly been the spine of a bird. "He will copy first," she said. "Reading can come after he learns which parts of his sight are untrustworthy." They sat me at a wooden desk whose surface had been softened by generations of elbows and sharpened by generations of knives. Before me they set a codex, bound in leather, the color of rainwater, shortly before it forgets how to be clear. The clasp was a small iron hand, and it did not want to open. When the custos unlatched it, the skin of the book exhaled. A smell came up, old vellum and old milk, and something like the shadow of a candle. The first page bore no title, only a red line that had once been straight and now wandered, as if the margin itself had grown restless. "Copy it as you see it," the custos said, "not as you wish it to be. When a line hesitates, let your hand hesitate. When a word fades, let your ink fade. If a letter refuses to choose a shape, give it the shape of refusal." I began. The script was lean and tall, the kind of hand written by people who knew how to walk long distances without wasting breath. Some letters leaned toward the next word as if confiding in it. Others leaned away as if refusing to be implicated. On the second page, the text changed mid-sentence to a script I had never met. My pen wanted to correct the inconsistency the way a choir wants to correct a single voice that won't find the pitch. I felt the custos's gaze on the back of my neck, like the weight of a psalm. "Copy what is." So I did, and the sentence looked like a river remembering 2 different mountains. Hour followed faithful hour. I copied saints I had never heard of, and miracles that behaved like parables until they remembered they were footnotes to something no longer cited. In the margins, I found other hands, speaking to the text as if trying to teach it manners. One note read, "Remove the woman, replace with an angel of ambiguous wing." Another said simply, "The year is an inconvenience." On a later page, the same hand had scratched out 3 lines and replaced them with a diagram of a compass rose whose north pointed sideways. When my fingers cramped, the custos slid a small dish across the table. Within it lay salt and ash. "For the ink," she said, "and for the memory of ink." She watched me rub my nib against the mixture until it bit the page with a sharper black. "What is this book?" I asked at last. "A gospel?" Her mouth twitched into what might, under more generous climates, have been a smile. "Everything down here is a gospel," she said. "Even the receipts." They took me to the chained aisle. In that aisle the books did not swing when men passed. Men swung when the books decided to breathe. I recognized a title from my earlier trespass, The Gospel of the Twin. The chain that held it was pitted with rust in the shape of fingerprints. Beside it hung a volume with the spine torn away so that the signatures showed like ribs. On its exposed binding, a strip of paper had been glued. Vitae Orbis, Lives of the World. The custos touched it with the back of her knuckles, the way a midwife tests a brow for fever. "This one likes to change its table of contents," she said. "We anchor it by reading it the same way, again and again, until it becomes tired of struggling." "And what is inside?" I asked. "Lives," she said. "Lives, and the instructions for deleting them without killing their ghosts." Next came the drawer of toneless bells. It looked like a cabinet, but when she slid it open, the smell of a chapel came out, a coolness with edges. Inside lay a set of brass tongues, each thin as a leaf, each stamped with a date and a place. "These were taken from bells that once called men to worship facts," the custo said. "We keep the tongues to remind the bells that silence has liturgy too." She lifted one marked with a year that never existed in any of my calendars. The shape felt heavy with announcements no longer permitted to arrive. In a niche we found a box bound in catgut. The custos cut the ties with a knife that had kissed more than twine. Within lay a stack of maps so thin they were closer to skin than paper. When she held one up, it quivered like something at the edge of waking. Seas wore names I had never heard. Islands winked into being like thoughts that could not be held long because to hold them would require inventing a people to dream them. "Who drew these?" I asked. "People who were a little too early," she said, "or a little too late." On a chalkboard fixed to the wall with nails that had once served elsewheres, someone had written an equation in a neat, confident hand. Chronology equals theology divided by utility. Beneath it, another hand had written, "No. Chronology equals obedience raised to the power of fear." And beneath that, as if the chalk had wandered back alone after lights out, "No. Chronology equals whoever owns the eraser." I laughed, a small voiceless laugh that blew powder from my lip. "You find this funny?" the custos asked. "I find it exact," I said. She seemed satisfied with the admission and wiped the board clean with her sleeve. "Never leave the truth where a visitor can read it," she said. "Truth ages poorly when people try to make it polite." Across the room, set away from the regular shelves, as if quarantined, stood a case with a glass front darkened by history's breath. Behind the glass lay a single book on a felt cradle. Its cover was unmarked, its edges gilt. A card on the shelf read, "Liber Absentiae, the Book of Absence, Consultation, by Ritual Only." The custos unlocked the case and did not open the book. She merely placed her fingertips on the cover, as a physician often does on the wrist of a patient whose pulse will not be bullied. "This is the inventory of what is missing," she said, "not what is lost. Lost things sometimes return on their own, like dogs gone to smell the fields." Missing things are those we help into the dark. Do not ask why. In the archives, why corrodes faster than iron. But I did ask, because the remnants of my education still believed that questions are saints that protect us from despair. Why erase? I said. Why erase at all? She looked up at the vaulted ceiling as if expecting it to answer. When it did not, she said, because there are rooms upstairs that must look simple if people are to go on living in them. Because some names grow too large and need to be returned to the size of men. Because the calendar is an instrument, and instruments must be tuned. Because sometimes an idea becomes a plague. Her eyes softened, not with kindness, but with a discipline that had survived kindness. And because power, like fire, grows anxious when left alone. We worked through the hours that have no church bells. I copied fragments from texts chained for good reason and bad. I learned how to hold a page so that it did not bruise. I learned which inks behaved like disguises and which inks insisted on being seen as themselves. My pen began to move without waiting for me. I developed the archivist's back, the archivist's cough, the archivist's habit of closing books with the same gentleness used to close a beloved's eyes. Near midnight, the custos led me to a door I had mistaken for a panel. It opened onto a narrow passage that smelled of vinegar and old rope. The scriptorium of revision, she said. We entered a room buzzing like a hive that had learned to hum Gregorian modes. Monks sat at desks with knives and brushes and stones for erasing. Some were young enough to believe they were saving lives. Some were old enough to know which life was being saved. On a long table lay a chain of pages strung together on a cord, each page bearing a date and a line of text that disagreed with the line before it. A man with a face like an earnest candle moved along the chain with a sponge, washing away words that had grown unfashionable. The palimpsest shone like a scar that had been taught manners. "What is this?" I asked. "An index," the custos said, "to a book that will be printed next year." "But the pages are old," I said. "Next year is old," she answered. In a corner, an old priest worked with a magnifying lens that looked like a small planet held on a stick. He was painting tiny red dots above certain letters, accent marks for a language that never used them. I stood behind him for a while, trying to divine the pattern. "Why add accents?" I asked at last. "Because accents make an alphabet look modest," he said without turning. "People trust modesty." He dabbed another dot. "Also, when you change a word's music, you change how it is remembered." At the back of the scriptorium stood a rack hung with garments I could not name. Robes stitched entirely from margins, cut from other books, capes made of catalogue cards sewn in scales. A cowl pieced together from colophons, the signatures where scribes confess themselves responsible for what a text has done to the world. "For ceremonies," the custos said. "Which ceremonies?" I asked. "The ones we never speak of," she said. "The ones that clean the instruments after they have been used." She let me hold the index of redactions, a narrow ledger that contained only dates and verbs, all in Latin, all drab as bureaucracy, and yet the more I read, the drier my mouth felt. Delete, diminish, defer, translate, translate again, attribute elsewhere, attribute upward, attribute downward, attribute to no one, seal, unseal, seal again, insert miracle, remove miracle, replace miracle with misunderstanding, replace misunderstanding with parable, replace parable with calendar. I shut the ledger, before the last verb could find me. In the hours when men on the surface turned in their sheets and sighed names they would never admit to owning, we returned to the central table. The custos placed a small wooden box between us. It was inlaid with mother of pearl in a pattern that looked like a map of cities that rearranged themselves to confuse invaders. For you, she said, when you are sent here without me. Inside was a pair of gloves, a bone folder, a tiny brush, a key that could not decide what kind of tooth it wanted, a vial of powder white as resignation, and a card printed with a single instruction. Always replace the book in the place that replaced the book. I must have looked baffled. Shelving is not geography, she said. It's diplomacy. We went then to a place I had not noticed. A staircase tucked behind a picture of a hallway, the kind of trick a child would invent to amuse adults who need to be convinced they still have imaginations. At the bottom of the stairs stood a short door with a rosary nailed above it. The crucifix was missing. The beads hung like a patient vertebrae. We entered a room that had no shelves at all. Instead, wooden pegs dotted the walls, and from each peg hung a sack marked with a date and a noun: harvest, flood, council, silence. What is this? I asked, almost whispering out of respect for the ingenuity of the lie. Ephemera, she said. The world sheds it the way trees shed leaves. We save some to remind the world what shape it had last winter. A sack near the door bore a single word: amnesty. I touched it and felt a brittle softness, like paper that had spent years rehearsing how to crumble gracefully. Do you ever? I began. No, she said, correctly hearing the question I had not framed. Mercy is upstairs. Down here we practice accuracy. Accuracy can be a crueler god than justice. Once you kneel to it, it kneels on you in return. That is how I found myself entrusted, some months later, with a rite I had not known existed, the turning of the pages. It sounded gentle when the Monsignor first spoke of it, as if all that was required was to keep the air moving around a book so that the dark would not pool on a single leaf. In truth, the ceremony was a surgery performed on time. We met after midnight in a room shaped like a clock with the hands removed. On a table at the center lay an enormous volume bound in ironwork that resembled the ribs of a whale. Around it stood 7 of us in silence, each holding a candle in an iron holder welded to a chain secured to the floor, so that the light knows where it belongs, the Monsignor said. The custos nodded to me. I stepped forward and placed my gloved fingers on the lower right corner of the page. Ready? She said, and at her word the candles tilted inwards as if bowing, and I turned the page. There is a sound certain pages make when they have been waiting too long. It is not a crack or a sigh. It is the polite relief of an elder who has finally been told he may sit down. The new page shone very slightly as if grateful. The text on it revealed a year that never appears in public chronologies, a year the archives had placed between 2 others so that the narrative above would not wobble like a table missing a leg. I read a single line: edict issued, saint unmade. Feast reassigns itself to a day already heavy with memory. The custos leaned in and with a swallow of breath blew a fine powder across the page. The letters darkened, then steadied. Fixation, she said. So tomorrow does not change its mind about yesterday. We turned pages for an hour. We moved time as gardeners move soil, gently, aware of roots, incapable of pretending we created the plants. When it was finished, the custos lifted the iron frame and the book shut itself as a mollusk shuts. Somewhere in the labyrinth, a long door, one of the doors that never bothers with hinges, made the sound of a decision being accepted. It was after a later turning that I committed my first honest theft. The act was small, but size and guilt do not share a scale. While closing a drawer, I saw, tucked beneath a sheaf of catalog cards, a fragment of parchment no larger than my palm. It bore a single sentence in a hurried hand. If memory cannot be forbidden, it can be distracted. The words were plain, but they rang in the bones of my face. I slid the fragment into my sleeve. It lay against my skin like a second pulse. For days afterwards I walked the corridors expecting every chain to lift and point at my chest. No one noticed. Or perhaps everyone did and decided the text had chosen me. I hid the fragment inside my breviary, between the psalms for nights when the world refuses to sleep. I read it again and again until it felt like a prayer, though not one I could ever offer aloud. If memory cannot be forbidden, it can be distracted. The sentence explained the archives better than any lecture, the noise we made to keep attention from straying into rooms where questions were kept hungry. Weeks after my theft, the custos summoned me alone. She had placed 3 books on the table, each unmarked. "Open one," she said. I chose the middle. Within I found pages of names written in a slanted hand, each name followed by a small notation moved. Erased, altered, divided, returned. No places, no dates, only the grammar of interference. "What is this?" I asked, though I already knew. "A litany," she said. "A saint is a memory trained to stand still. Some stand too still for too long." She closed the book gently with both hands, as if it contained a bird that must not be bruised. "Take care," she said, "that you do not become a saint to this place." I did not know how to take care. I knew only how to descend when called. And so when, on an evening that smelled faintly of rain and extinguished lamps, a young brother with eyes like wet bark asked me to follow him to a door I had not seen before, I obeyed. The door was small, child-sized, almost playful, set into the base of a larger door whose ornamentation pretended to be distracted. Behind it, a corridor crawled, low enough that I had to stoop like a penitent. It brought us to a chamber that hummed without sound. At its center stood a pedestal bearing a globe. Not the earth, not any earth I knew, but a sphere inscribed with constellations that did not match the sky of my life. The stars were arranged in scripts. The scripts formed sentences. The sentences moved. A man I had never met turned to us and nodded. His hair was white the way the inside of a seashell is white. "Astrarium," he said, and the globe slowed. "A language built from the memory of light. Before maps lied, they told stories. Before calendars lied, they sang." He touched a point of light that was not a star, and a corridor somewhere behind us breathed open. "Upstairs they argue about doctrine," he said. "Down here we argue about gravity." He smiled. It was almost gentle. "When time bends," he said, "men need to be reminded how to walk." I stood very still, so as not to harm the air. The globe turned, and for a heartbeat my name seemed to cross its surface like the shadow of a bird. "What is my work here?" I asked. "To carry," he said. "To carry without dropping, to drop without shattering, to shatter without noise." The globe stopped. The stars rearranged themselves into silence. "Go now," he said, and I went. If this reads like madness, forgive me. Madness is simply a measurement taken with the wrong instrument. What looks extravagant to the healthy is the daily bread of the diseased. What looks diseased to the obedient is the daily bread of the archives. I learned to eat both breads and call neither of them by name. In the final weeks of my apprenticeship, the custos brought me back to the glass case. "The Book of Absence," she said, unlocking it with a key that looked like a question mark taught to obey. "You may open it once. The book will choose the page." I did, as told. The cover lifted like a door reluctantly leaving its frame. The page the book chose bore no text. There was only a faint impression in the vellum, as if something had been pressed there long ago and then withdrawn with grace. I leaned closer. Heat rose from the page, body heat, not mine. For one terrible instant, I felt a name I loved slide out of my head as a fish slides from a net. I put my hand flat upon the whiteness. It was like touching a scar on a world I could not see. "Enough," the custos said, and closed it. The numbness in my mind retreated like water leaving a stone. "Why show me that?" I asked, shivering despite the still air. "Because you asked why we erase," she said. "It is easier to explain to the hand than to the ear." That night, in my cell, I dreamed of a calendar whose days were blank but warm, like sheets from a bed just left. When I woke, the parchment fragment in my breviary had curled itself into a small fist. I smoothed it and read the sentence again. "If memory cannot be forbidden, it can be distracted." I understood then that Chapter 2 was not merely the tour of a hostile museum. It was training in the craft of distraction, the choreography by which history learns to step around itself without making footprints. And so I tell you this, with the calm of a pen scratching in the dark. The forbidden archives are not a graveyard. They are a workshop. What is forged there is not doctrine or dogma, though sometimes those are the sheath. What is forged there is forgetting that pretends to be forgiveness, and remembering that pretends to be scholarship, and calendars that pretend to be clocks while quietly moving the furniture of time. I left the archives at dawn, my eyes full of the dust that falls from the wings of chained books when they twitch in their sleep. In the square, the vendors shouted, and the pigeons wrote their single clumsy letter across the air. The world looked perfectly ordinary, which is the surest sign that something has been adjusted. I felt a tenderness for the people buying bread and pointing up at statues. They would never be asked to turn pages with iron chains tied to their light. They would never be asked to open a book that opens them in return. They would be told stories, and they would tell those stories to their children, and those stories would be better at keeping them warm than the truth. But the truth is not a stove. It is a window. Tomorrow, if you will follow me, we will lean our foreheads to its cold glass and learn what the archives taught me next. That time can be edited with a quill, that centuries can be lifted like carpets, and the floor swept clean beneath, that the calendar is a blade, and the hand that holds it does not tremble. We will watch the hours being rearranged. We will hear the click when a year slides into a socket it does not belong to. We will count with the men who decide which dawns to keep. They did not call it the clock room. Clocks are polite. They tell you when to eat, and when to sleep, and when to be late. This room had another purpose. On its door, a small plaque read, "Horologium ad Sanandum Tempus," the place where time is healed. I learned quickly that healing here meant cutting and stitching, that mercy here could make you limp. The Monsignor brought me after midnight, and left me at the threshold as though I were an offering. Within, the air had the crispness of mountain shade. In the center stood a wheel taller than a man, iron spokes arcing toward a rim engraved with months in languages that never shared a table. The wheel did not turn, it breathed. With each breath, the numerals around its edge trembled, as if reluctantly remembering their sequence. Around the wheel, on pedestals of worn stone, lay tools, quills, knives, brushes tipped with hair, a small plane like a carpenter's but designed to shave dates. I thought of a carpenter I once knew who made cradles and coffins with the same hands. On the far wall hung calendars like flags. Julian, Gregorian, and others that preferred to remain unnamed. Some had scars where days had been removed, the stitches so tidy that you would not notice unless you kissed the fabric. Some had patches where weeks had been added, like elbows to sleeves. A thin priest with cheeks like pages kept too close to a flame approached and bowed his head without obedience. "You've copied enough," he said. "Tonight you will pull." "Pull what?" I asked. "Time," he said, and smiled with the fatigue of a man who has taught a dangerous joke to survive by becoming serious. He guided my hands to a rope that looked harmless as laundry line. The rope rose into the dark and disappeared. "On my word," he said, "it will resist. Do not argue. We do not seek consent here. We seek alignment." He raised his eyes to the breathing wheel. "Ready. Now." I pulled. The rope offered the stubbornness of a mule. Then, all at once, it yielded with a dry gasp that seemed to come from under the floor. The wheel exhaled. The numbers around its rim shifted, not much like a smile a stranger thinks you did not catch, but enough to make the room's temperature forget itself. Somewhere in the labyrinth, a bell rehearsed one stroke and chose not to finish it. "What did we move?" I whispered. "A remainder," he said. "A day that stuck between months when the world was new and arithmetic was not yet ashamed." He showed me the ledgers stacked on a nearby lectern. Errata to centuries, supplement of dawns, retirement of feasts. Pages of tidy lines, their precision an insult if you loved chaos, a mercy if you loved order, a peril if you had ever loved truth. Names of councils, names of popes, some crossed out so cleanly they had learned how to be blank with grace. Annotations in a tiny hand. Advance Easter by a breath. Forgive October 11 days. It will become less quarrelsome. Install a hinge in 1582. "You think the calendar is a witness?" the priest asked. "No, it is an accomplice." At the edge of the room, a door opened like a sigh. The custos entered, veil pinned with a small iron star. She gave me a look like the press of a seal. "Tonight," she said, "you learn the doctrine that dare not be written. Chronology is pastoral care. Sheep cannot graze on cliffs. Sometimes we move the field." They led me to a bench below a circular window whose glass was frosted in patterns like breath arrested mid-lament. Through it, I could see the tower that holds the bells. A man stood within, framed by darkness. He lifted his arm. His hammer paused above the metal mouth. "We will stop the ring for a minute," the priest said. "When men tell this story, they will say the bell missed a stroke because a sparrow fell asleep upon the clapper. Do you understand?" I nodded. He whispered a prayer that had no nouns. The man in the tower did not strike. That minute did not exist. The city continued to talk to itself. Lovers turned. Guards yawned. Bakers set dough to rise. Cats insisted on their small heresies. But the minute was not. Unborn. Unburied. The priest marked a line in the ledger and blew a pinch of powder fixation across it. "We have removed worse," he said, "but the little surgeries teach the hand to be steady when the heart is not." "Why change time at all?" I asked, not because I expected a clean answer, but because questions are breathing exercises in rooms without air. "Because memory is greedy," the custo said. "Because the earth spins stubbornly and refuses to match doctrine. Because human days never align with holy days for long. Because empires require anniversaries, like infants require milk. Because men will kill one another to satisfy the arithmetic of a date that tells them it is time to be glorious or time to confess." She showed me a drawer labeled "Phantom Years." Inside lay thin linens on which numbers had been written in a zero's pale ink. When I touched one, my finger cooled as if time had teeth. "These are the years we raised, walked across, then set back down in shadow," she said. "Historians who are too careful feel a draft when passing them, but drafts do not earn tenure." She replaced the cloth with a tenderness that shamed every tenderness I thought I knew. "Do not romanticize it," she added. "Romance is upstairs. Down here we practice moodless surgery." In the next chamber, the walls curved like the interior of a shell. On the floor, a circle divided into wedges, like a fruit. On each wedge, a word had been painted: seed, feast, war, tax, penance, crown, plague, pilgrimage, Sabbath, famine. The wheel overhead lowered until it nearly kissed the wedges. "This is how the calendar learns diplomacy," the priest said. "A year cannot serve all masters at once. We persuade it to put on its clothes in a sequence that keeps most people from despairing with the same breath." He placed a small brass weight upon seed. The wheel tilted nearly imperceptibly toward spring. He placed another upon tax. The tilt corrected itself obediently. Then he handed me a weight engraved with the relief of a fish. "Lent," he said. "Where?" My hand hovered. If I placed it on penance, famine would sing louder than usual. If I placed it on feast, men would sin with the swagger of pardon. The custos watched me with a gaze that asked whether I would be a man who loved people more than ideas, or ideas more than people. I set the weight upon Sabbath, and felt the room accept this like a compromise at a wedding where no one entirely approves. "You will do," she said. "There is a ritual older than correction and newer than mercy, the reassignment of births. I learned it from a sister whose voice had the beautiful monotony of a well-behaved fountain. We knelt at a bench where a ledger lay open under a veil, names written with exquisite care, each followed by a date, each date followed by a symbol, an asterisk for ignoble, a cross for convenient, a small blade for dangerous. "Some men must be moved," she said. "We do not change that they were born. We change when the world is told to celebrate it." She guided my pen to a name that made my hand tremble, though I would not have confessed that tremor to a friend, a scholar whose theories I had admired, whose feast had become a holiday of reason in some countries. "We move him 3 days backward," she said. "So his parade no longer shadows a saint who needs light." I shifted the date. The ink looked guilty. "Truth?" she asked gently. "Not truth," I said. "Balance," she nodded. "Balance is the name truth uses when it wants to be allowed in the room." From the horologian we went to a place the archives called the Workshop of Drift, a long hall with windows high as ship sails and light cold as mathematics. Along one wall stood rollers on which months were stretched like hides. Apprentices combed them with stiff brushes, raising the nap of the days so that ink would take evenly. Along the other wall, a series of narrow tables bore what I first mistook for rosaries. They were strings of beads, yes, but each bead was a year, and each year could be slid forward or back with a click that made my palate taste iron. "Canonical drift," said the man supervising, a compact creature with wrists like knotted rope. "Years move the way continents do. We assist them when they try to collide with faith." He placed the string in my hands. The years were warm. I imagined the many palms that had warmed them. "Slide forward," he said, "until the council sits where a council must sit." I slid 3 beads, felt resistance, as if pushing a bookshelf loaded with rumors. He touched my thumb. "Now backward one. Good. Council has chairs." He smiled, with what might have been pride if pride had been permitted there. "You have a steady sacrilege." "Is it sacrilege?" I asked. "Sacrilege is a word for rearranging furniture in a house someone else owns," he said. "We own the house, or we rent it from a landlord who does not collect." He shrugged. "Either way, the chairs must fit the table." Often we spoke lightly to survive the heaviness, but sometimes the lightness cracked. That happened the night they invited me to. The conclave of minutes. No room wears its name more precisely. It is small, round, and mean. A dozen of us sat on hard stools with a bowl of stones between us, each stone etched with a number from 1 to 60. The custos explained the rule. A month was misbehaving. It had seized too many hours, and a saint's vigil had begun drowning men who were trying to keep their shops. We would remove minutes, one by one, reassigning them to the tail of a month later in the year. We were not to speak the minutes aloud. We were to choose by touch. As the bowl moved around the circle, I felt shame for the comfort of my hands. When it reached me, I lifted 2 stones, 17 and 42. 17 felt like a cough. 42 felt like a sigh. "Accepted," the custos said, and the bell in the tower inhaled as if the city had decided not to cry. Afterward, I found myself alone with her in the corridor. "Do you ever fear we will be discovered?" I asked. "By whom?" she said. "By the people who keep time in their pockets?" She laid her palm against the wall. And the wall, I swear, settled slightly as if pleased to be chosen. "We will be discovered by those who need to discover us," she said. "And by then it will not matter. I wish I could tell you I resisted. I wish I could say the young priest who entered the horologion became the old man who exposed it. But resistance is not a genre the Labyrinth publishes. Instead, it teaches you to carry fire without appearing to be warm. I carried. I practiced the drowsy violences required by pastoral arithmetic. I learned how to whisper the prayer that stops a bell, and how to start it again with forgiveness. I learned the sound a century makes when it accepts a correction it doesn't deserve. One winter night, during a turning, the book refused to open. We pressed our gloved hands to its ironwork. We breathed the formula upon it. The powder of fixation darkened our cuffs, and still it sulked. The room grew colder. The wheel drew a breath and did not release it. The priest with page cheeks frowned in anger, then in fear. "What does it want?" I asked. The custos lowered her head, as if speaking to a child who had hidden under a table. "It wants a life," she said. "Every great edit requires a life." She did not look at me when she said it, but my throat learned the taste of brass. A week later, a guard without a tongue was found collapsed near the stair that leads to the grate I had been told not to notice. He was not dead. He had donated the portion of himself that would have asked why. The book opened without complaint afterward. We turned 3 pages. We moved an equinox by the width of regret. I slept badly for a month and began to forget the face of my father. You think this melodrama? I ask your patience. Spend long enough in the company of men who move minutes, and you begin to recognize the cost. Teeth grinding themselves into powder at night, hands learning to shake only when washed, eyes that start from the middle of the face because the edges no longer trust them. Time is not a cloth you can pull without fraying it. We frayed it and called the threads pastoral. It was during this season of adjustments that I stumbled, almost literally, upon a ledger left open on a desk. I had come to return a knife to its pouch. Our knives were always returned, always clean, and the desk beside the pouch carried pages that should have been covered. I did not mean to read, but reading and breathing had become similar. The ledger's title, Index of Fabricated Pontificates, lines of names, some known to me, some strangers, some that looked like placeholders screamed in small letters. Dates assigned with the confidence of a lie that has hired a tutor. Notes, inserted to repair the succession after the plague. Useful for reconciling 2 feuds. Retire after council. Replace with martyr to stabilize calendar. I stood with my fingers hovering above the page, like a surgeon about to regret. The custos found me there, not touching, not yet. She did not close the book. She did not slap my hand. She said, "Now you understand why the chairs around the pit carried names you could not pronounce." Her voice had the tired mercy of a mother who finds a child reading the family ledger. "You will ask if they existed," she said. "Yes, in the way a bridge exists when men walk across air. We did not invent water, we arranged it." "What happens to the men whose names we borrow?" I asked. "Sometimes we give them back," she said. "Sometimes we keep them elsewhere." She nodded toward a corridor I had never followed. Chapter 4 will explain. Saints that stood too still. Popes that kept the seat warm while time learned manners. Identities we made to repair a clock. Come. You have learned how to move minutes. Next, you will learn how we move faces. We replaced the ledger in the place that replaced the ledger. The rope in the clockroom dangled like a nerve that had been taught restraint. The wheel breathed a little easier, as if relieved to have confessed. I pressed my palm to the table where we laid our tools and felt the faintest vibration, as though centuries were purring under my hand. This is the sin that does not sound like sin when chanted by the right choirs. Not murder, not theft, not adultery, but rearrangement. There is a reason carpenters are beloved by the faithful. They make structures that persuade gravity to look away. In the horologion we practiced a similar craft on time, and like carpenters who must eventually meet the people who sleep under the roofs they raise, we must eventually meet the ones who wore the names we moved. That meeting is tomorrow. That meeting will tear my voice. For now, know this: time, like authority, despises a vacuum. We made years when none were available and removed years that bred rebellions. We slid births to give saints room to breathe. We stooped to pick up minutes that spilled under history's table. We stopped bells so that men would not count a grief and think it sacred. We installed hinges in centuries. We called it pastoral. We called it mercy. We called it necessary so often that the word wore through and showed the iron underneath. And still, when I close my eyes, I feel the rope in my hands, warm from other palms, and hear the small cough the wheel makes when it decides to move. I wonder how many lives are braided into that rope, how many names spliced into our string of years. The ledger of fabricated pontificates waits in its drawer like a patient animal. The corridor towards saints erased. Popes forged smells faintly of smoke, as if a page had recently been turned and discovered it was tinder. Tomorrow we enter that corridor. Tomorrow the blank faces on statues will teach me what erasure costs the erased. Tomorrow I will place my hand on a shoulder that is not a shoulder and feel it tremble like a year accepting guilt. Remember me while I still know how to speak. They led me through a corridor that smelled of marble dust and extinguished vows. The custos did not speak. The Monsignor kept his eyes lowered, as if he were escorting me to a wake where the corpse might still change its mind. At the far end stood a door I had mistaken, many times before, for a wall. It opened with the weary courtesy of a book that has been asked to perform its trick too often. On a brass plaque, small and embarrassed, someone had engraved Sanctuaria Negata, for internal cult only. Within, the air had the coolness of a crypt and the alertness of an operating theater. Along the walls stood statues, life-sized and slightly more than life. Many had faces, many did not. Some faces had been shaved down to a smooth anonymity. Others had been resculpted into expressions that looked obedient to a rumor. Plinths bore names that shifted when you tried to focus letters, wavering like candlelight in a draft you cannot locate. A woman in a gray habit moved among them with a brush and bowl, washing dust from shoulders as one might bathe a child who has not decided whom to grow into. The gallery of almost, the custos said at last. The saints who nearly were, the saints who used to be, the saints who have been repurposed into usefulness, do not touch. She did not say it sharply. She said it like a prayer to a nervous god. A statue near the entrance held my attention. The figure was hooded. Beneath the hood, the face was not erased, but half erased. A cheek intact beside a plane as smooth as calm water. On the plinth, a name had been carved, and then half removed, leaving only Mena. Who? I asked. She kept watch during a siege, the custos said. She opened gates for children and closed them for men carrying fire. She died under a door. People loved her too quickly. We needed her to cool. She gestured to the unfinished face. A tempered halo. If you dim a miracle, the light lasts longer. Across from her stood a figure with the opposite problem. A face too full, features too convinced of their own clarity. The plinth bore a name I knew from catechism, Sanctus Hadrianus, and under it a date that would not sit still. I remembered the ledger in the clockroom index of fabricated pontificates, and felt the room tilt. Yes, the custos said, seeing the recognition. Sometimes a chair needs a body as a table needs a leg. We forge a pope the way a bridge is forged across a river, by giving men something to step on so they do not remember the water. Did he live? I asked. He lived like a parable, she said. True in more places than one, useful in more hours than most. She dipped her brush and washed the stone eyelids with a tenderness that shamed me. Do not despise him. A fabricated pontiff has often kept worse truths from drowning better ones. The Monsignor motioned me onward. We entered a long, narrow chamber, where shelves carried objects that could not decide whether they were relics or records. sandals with dates stitched into the leather, rings with tiny saints engraved on the inside where only the skin would feel them. Fingernails glued to slips of parchment, each labeled in a script that apologized for itself. At the back, a table displayed stacks of dossiers tied with linen tape. The top sheet of the top file read, Positio Super Virtutibus, the file by which a candidate approaches canonization. These are the paused causes, the Monsignor said, and the causes that were once paused and then redirected. Redirected? I said. The custos loosened a tie and opened a file. Within lay testimonies, photographs, letters pressed so flat they had learned to speak in 2 dimensions. She pointed to a paragraph where a witness described a cure that did not satisfy the rules. The tumor had shrunk, but the patient had learned to live without needing it to vanish. A non-conforming miracle, she said. We prefer habits of the body that accommodate grace. She replaced the page, then extracted a second document, identical letterhead, identical type, but the paragraphs had been arranged as if reality had been taught. Grammar. Conforming, she said. The event is the same. The posture is improved. I felt nausea rise, not the nausea of disgust, but the nausea of altitude, the kind that tells climbers the air is no longer loyal. Is any of it true? I asked, and hated the panic in my voice. The truest things here are the wounds, the custos said softly, and the love that wanted the wounds to mean more than pain. We passed into a studio where artisans practiced the science of reverence. On one bench, a craftsman shaved a nose from a statue's face, catching the dust in a velvet pouch stamped with a number. On another, a woman pinned a paper halo behind a portrait, moving the circle by millimeters to find the angle that made the eyes look beginners again. A younger novice worked at a desk covered with vellum ovals, faces painted with care, then soaked and rubbed until the features blurred into kindness. Iconostasis rehabilitation, the custos murmured. When a saint's image becomes too severe, the faithful turn the severity into a mirror. We teach the image to be merciful, so the mirror returns what a bruised life can use. In the corner, a small furnace ticked, as if remembering how to breathe. Above it hung molds, foreheads, noses, mouths catalogued in drawers beneath with labels that read compassion, medium or irony, light or penitence, heavy. Masks for statues? I said. Faces, the Monsignor corrected. Masks are for hiding. Faces are for meeting. We replace a face when the old one learns the wrong kind of authority. The next room was worse. Its door bore no plaque, only a white ribbon pinned to the jamb like a bandage. Inside, tables were set with shallow trays of water. In each tray lay a sheet of paper on which a name had been written. As I watched, letters bled very slowly, the ink loosening its grip on meaning. Beside every tray, a monk kept the water stirred with a glass rod. The lavacrum nominum, the custos said, the bath of names. Sometimes we do not erase a saint. We wash him. The name remains. The story thins. He can still be invoked at a baptism, but he cannot be weaponized at a rally. I read a name that once had brought thunder to pulpits. In the tray it softened to a whisper. And if the people refuse to let go? I asked. People do not refuse, the custos said. They drift. Memory is a tide. We tilt the moon. We moved on to a chamber with a ceiling low enough to frighten pride. Cabinets lined the walls, each drawer bearing a single verb: subtract, merge, lend, borrow, inherit, retire. The custos slid open merge. Inside lay tiny cards with 2 names apiece, connected by threads dyed different colors, some knots elegant, some ugly and hurried. She drew one at random. Vitus and Vito, the youthful martyr and the baker turned healer, whose feast soothed a city's migraines. Regional redundancies, she said. 2 kindnesses pointing at the same wound. We merge, and the calendar stops, tripping over itself. In lend, the cards listed a single saint and a quality courage, patience, heat with a line indicating a temporary consignment. When a city needs more mercy than its patron can carry, we lend, the Monsignor said. When the need passes, we recall. The ledger balances. He said it like a man who has spent his life watching scales waggle back toward justice without ever landing. At the end of the cabinet stood a drawer locked with 2 keys. The custos produced one from her habit. The Monsignor produced the other from within his sleeve. They turned them together. The drawer slid out as carefully as a confession. Inside lay a single book bound in gray leather, Liber Abdicatorum, the book of abdicated saints, not fallen, the custos said, before I could ask. Abdicated. Some relics refuse to do any more harm. Some cults ask to be extinguished. We record their resignations and grant them rest. The Preser, in Messer, she opened to a page where a name had been written and then struck through, not with violence but with something like gratitude. A pressed flower lay in the gutter of the book. He was invoked to bless wheat, she said. Then his image was used to bless the burning of fields. He asked to be dismissed from both employments. She closed the book, and for a moment placed her palm upon it. The tender gesture was indecently human. And the popes? I asked. Where are the forged ones kept when their work is done? The Monsignor led me to an alcove behind a curtain heavy as doctrine. There, on shallow shelves, stood 12 busts in a row, faces familiar and unfamiliar, each with that mild, supervisory benevolence shared by men who have been taught since childhood to practice blessing as posture. Between 2 I recognized sat a face with no name. The marble had been left rough where letters should have lived. A small tag hung from the base. Pro tempore. He sat in the line where time failed, the Monsignor said. Between pestilence and repair. He absorbed the shock. How do you make a pope? The question came out before I could perfect it. Very carefully, the custos said, and very briefly. She pointed to a workbench where 3 men leaned over a matrix of genealogies spread like nets. A pontificate is a bridge, she said. You do not make the river. You find the stones strong enough to carry a span. A name, a place of birth, a cause of death, one encyclical that does no damage. Enough witnesses to sound plausible, enough gaps to be useful. The rest is calendar. Is it a lie? I asked. It is a way for truth to keep walking, she said, when it would otherwise have to swim. We passed to a vault whose door was carved with 12 small keys, none of which turned. The custos laid her hand on the metal and spoke a sentence that contained only consonants. The door warmed and tolerated us. Inside, a museum of paper. Letters of resignation never sent. Letters of acceptance never written. Bulls drafted and then undrafted. Diagrams of conclaves that decided to be shorter. Oaths bent to fit throats. At the center, on a pedestal, a small wooden box. Archivum subrosa, under the rose. She opened it and revealed a ring. Not gold, not silver iron, plain as bread, For the forgeries, she said. One of them wore it once, briefly. It kept the weight from looking like theft. I did not ask whether I might touch it. She placed it in my palm, and I felt the shock of how ordinary salvation can be when it is practiced as carpentry. The ring had warmed to many hands. It knew the circumference of fear. "Return it," she said softly, and I did. They allowed me to sit for a time among the statues. The hooded woman with the half-face, the Pope who was a bridge, a soldier saint with a spear that had been blunted so children would not dream of sharpening themselves, a midwife whose hands had been sculpted twice, once with a child resting in them, once empty so that the sculptor could exchange them depending on whether the city needed hope or honesty that year. I thought of the bath of names, of water loitering around a story until the edge softened. I thought of the book of abdications, where fatigue was permitted to become a form of prayer. "Do you hate us yet?" the custos asked from the doorway. "I don't know," I said. "I am learning new verbs." She nodded. "Hatred is a noun. We work in verbs." We left the gallery of almost and entered a corridor whose bricks were slightly warmer than stone should be. The air carried a sweetness I recognized from church basements after bake sales and funerals, sugar and grief. "You will see one more room," the Monsignor said. "Then you will decide whether to continue." His face suggested he had spoken those words before, and that the decisions had not brought him sleep. The room was small, a wooden chair, a table with a single folder on it, on the wall, a mirror ordinary, even disinterested. The folder contained a name I knew in the way a child knows the name of the tallest tree in his town, a saint from my boyhood, patron of the frightened. His prayers had steadied my lungs at night. The folder held evidence I was not prepared to hold, testimonies arranged into a biography that fit better in the hand of government than in the hand of prayer. Photographs where the young priest I loved seemed to be standing in two places at once because two committees required it. A signature that had learned to be both his and somebody else's. Attached with a rusted clip, a memo from the archives recommending remedial devotion to thin the cult gently without shattering it, to allow the saint to retire to hospital wards and kitchens where faith does its best work without applause. "Leave him," I said, my throat finding only one syllable it could afford. "Let him stay. That is what we are doing," the custos said, and her voice broke on the yaw like a wave on a stair. "We are leaving him where he helps. We are removing him from the places that loved his name more than his work." I sat a long time, the mirror not interfering. I remembered the ring of iron. I remembered the bath of names. I remembered the half-face. At last I signed a paper I did not read because its meaning was as obvious as a ladder. I would continue. If I stopped here, I would be a man holding a word the city no longer knew how to pronounce. If I went on, I might learn how to keep it alive without making it a weapon. On the way out, the custos paused beside a door marked with chalk. "Commutatio, exchange." "We trade," she said. "We give a feast to a famine. We give a mercy to a war. We take back an authority from a rumor. We lend a pope to a year that insists on tearing. We take a saint from a street that has learned to use him as a lockpick." She wiped the chalk with the heel of her hand. The word blurred into smoke. "You will hate us on certain days," she added. "On others you will forgive us. Both responses are cheaper than understanding." When we stepped once more into the wider corridors, I heard the clockroom breathing. Time had been moved again, not far, just enough to be comfortable in the chair we had forced it to occupy. I realized that the gallery of Almost and the Horologion were not separate engines. They shared a shaft. We edited the hours. We edited the faces who would preside over those hours. And both surgeries were performed so that the story above would not bleed to death while trying to stay simple. That night, in my narrow bed, I dreamed of a church with 12 doors and no nave. People entered one door and left another, each carrying a small stone warmed in their hands. At the center, a statue turned slowly, wearing whatever face those hands required. When I woke, I knew Chapter 4 had ended. To survive it, I had learned to pronounce two truths at the same time. Some saints are erased so that sanctity does not become a banner. Some popes are forged so that succession does not become a wound. It is a grammar spoken by men who do not expect applause. Tomorrow they will take me where grammar ends. The room where science is domesticated into miracle, where art is bricked into altars, where education is taught to bite its own tongue, a place the archives call, without irony, the ministry of ultimate control. If you have followed me this far, keep your breath. The air is thinner there, and the instruments are sharper. They called it the ministry, though no state would dare claim it. A corridor led us there that did not believe in corners. It curved the way obedience curves beautifully, uselessly, until your feet forget the geometry of refusal. The custos walked ahead with her veil unpinned, as if pinning would make the air brittle. The Monsignor followed behind me, his shoes speaking a language of cautions to the floor. Between them, I was a needle-pulling thread. The door was a bland gray. No plaque, no seal, only a small brass circle the size of a communion wafer. The custos pressed 2 fingers to it, and it grew warm beneath her touch. "You will want to blink," she said. "Try not to. The room prefers the undistracted." Inside, the ceiling rose with clerical confidence. Light fell without announcing its source. On the left stretched the Hall of Domestic Miracles. On the right, the Gallery of Acceptable Beauty. Farther in, behind a low arch, a space with desks and chalkboards prepared for a subject that looked like arithmetic and behaved like hunger. I could feel the architecture measuring my pulse, calculating how much the day could afford to teach me. The Hall of Domestic Miracles was not grand. It was a kitchen. Copper pots gleamed like round sermons. Mortars and pestles lined a shelf, their bowls darkened with use. In the center, a long table carried small glass vials arranged like soldiers sentenced to precision. A woman in a white apron stirred something that breathed soft steam. It smelled of rosemary and rain on iron. "Sister Apothecary," the custos said by way of introduction. The woman nodded without wasting a word. She placed a drop from one vial into another. The liquid clouded, then cleared, then glowed the way certain fish glow when they have not yet decided whether they belong to the night. "What is this?" I asked. "Mercy," the sister said. "But we call it a miracle when mercy needs help being believed." She slid a tray toward me, labeled jars of powders, each bearing 2 names, the name used upstairs and the name used here. Something that was wormwood for the physicians was street, Bridget's breath for the faithful, willow bark was Our Lady's kiss. A tincture distilled from mold down in the damp rooms was a relic that did not require bone. "We do not forbid cures," the sister said. "We teach them to speak in parables. Men kneel more easily for parables." She tapped a ledger with her knuckle. In 2 columns it recorded recoveries, cause as taught to the hospital, cause as sung from the pulpit. The numbers matched within an acceptable lie. "The body is a difficult audience," she said. "It wants proof. Faith is a different audience. It wants meaning. The ministry ensures that both leave the theater learning to applaud the same cue." I watched her grind a powder that famously reduces fever. She layered it into a small wax packet, stamped with a saint's initials. "Will we claim a miracle?" I asked. "We will claim gratitude," she said. "Miracles should be rare. Gratitude can be rehearsed." She placed the packet in a drawer labeled with a season. "Winter prefers saints with warm hands," she said. We moved on. A small alcove contained instruments I recognized from the workshops of physicists and artisans. Lenses, prisms, coils of copper wound carefully around wooden forms, a glass tube through which a blue spark slithered like a letter learning to write itself. A friar leaned over the apparatus with the solemnity of a man who is allowed to hold lightning only because lightning has tired of disobedience. "Brother," the custos said, "show him the explanation." He turned a crank. The spark lengthened, then broke itself into tiny citizens of light marching in time. "Induction," he said. "But tonight it will be presented as an angel who refuses to be held." He smiled without joy. "We have found that men destroy what they understand when they are frightened. When they do not understand, they destroy with ceremony. Ceremony can be retaught." He pointed to a booklet prepared for distribution above, on the humility of fire, illustrations of candles, altars, lamps, a parable about patience, a footnote that warned gently against curiosity with wet hands. The experiment would be staged as cautionary devotion. The same, I saw, would be done with a lens and a sunbeam resurrected as a moral about how light, when focused, burns, an allegory for zeal supervised by obedience. "We are not hiding the world," the friar said, seeing calculation behind my eyes. "We are translating it into a tongue the frightened can survive." The gallery of acceptable beauty rained silence upon us. Paintings hung without ornament, each within a thin black frame that scolded with elegance. To an untutored eye, they were the sort of art that wins forgiveness by being expensive. But the labels told a second weather. Beneath each piece, 2 cards: original intention and approved use. A study of hands intended to show a lover how to be gentle had been repurposed as the charity of an archbishop. A landscape in which a city eats its own smoke had been relabeled Jerusalem rehearsing mercy. A small sculpture of a woman listening at a door had been turned 90 degrees on its base and renamed the Church Waiting for Penitents. "We do not command artists," the custos said. "We curate their posthumous grammar." At the gallery's end, a small forge burned with modest heat. An old man with a face wrinkled into a map of patience hammered thin gold into halos. "For restorations?" I asked. "For retirements," he said without looking up. "When an image grows too sure of itself, we give it a lighter crown. It learns humility again. The faithful see their own faces reflected in the thinness." Beyond the arch, desks and chalkboards waited. I recognized school. The rows were not accidental. They were a theology. At the front sat a woman with hair cut blunt as a verdict. She wore no habit. "Headmistress," the Monsignor murmured. She tapped the board with a piece of chalk, and the sound reminded me of a knuckle on a coffin. "Lesson," she said, "on curiosity." She wrote 2 columns. On the left, questions that build. On the right, questions that erode. Under build, she wrote, who, when, how many. Under erode, she wrote, why, why, why. 3 times, each why darker than the last. Children survive on the left, she said. Empires die on the right. She put the chalk down, as if relieved to have finished a prayer. We do not kill there, she said, and nodded upward to signal the world. We fatigue. They showed me a shelf labeled textbooks disguised as hymnals. Inside, slim volumes taught arithmetic under the cover of Beatitudes, geography under pilgrim routes, biology under lists of birds mentioned in Scripture. Curiosity was permitted to peck, but not to hunt. If they sing while they count, the headmistress said, they will not hear the question that would wreck the lesson. Another shelf. Hymnals disguised as textbooks. Songs wore the leather jackets of facts. A generation learns the rhythm of obedience while believing it is learning the world. We are not cruel, she said, as if tired of being accused by the future. We are careful. The human mind is a pantry. Leave the shelves bare, and rats move in. There was a room for confiscated syllogisms, arguments that looked sturdy until you walked around them and found the back missing. A young priest with broken acne and perfect posture was gluing spines to them, teaching them to stand just long enough to shepherd a crowd through a difficult season. Next door, the Museum of Dangers. Averted exhibits labeled with calm handwriting detailing heresies that never quite reached the bell towers because someone tripped them at the stairs. I thought the Inquisition was the great instrument, I said to the custos, my voice too literal for the room. The Inquisition was a firework, she said, loud, bright, over quickly, remembered for spectacle. This, she gestured around, is plumbing. You forget it is there until it fails. The city smells better because it works. A final corridor waited, short and wide, its walls hung with panels of dark felt. On each panel, a single object. A bell's tongue, a child's slate, a violin string, a piece of chalk, a spoon, a nail. Under each, a label. Silence, lesson, beauty, authority, hunger, structure, infrastructure of fear, the Monsignor said quietly, and for the first time I heard pity in him. Fear is a bridge between rooms. We maintain the bridge. We keep it from collapsing into panic or growing into rebellion. A city cannot live on courage alone. At the corridor's end stood a cabinet with a glass front. Inside, 12 masks rested on velvet. They were not theatrical. They were administrative. Each had a title engraved above the brow. Reasonable doubt, pious caution, scholarly reserve, moral panic, pastoral protection, traditional preference, necessary delay. Charitable interpretation, temporary measure, emergency rubric, customary silence, regrettable exception. Choose carefully, the custos said. You will wear some of these. The world will thank you for it, while forgetting your face. She closed the cabinet before my hand could hover. We came at last to a door set low into the wall. It opened onto a chamber smaller than a chapel and more ruthless than a tribunal. In the center stood a table with nothing on it. The custos and the Monsignor took stools set back against the walls. You will hear a story, the custos said. You must decide what the world will call it. The story was brought in by a boy with a box. Inside, a mechanism, A cluster of tubes and glass and small metal plates, built by a woman in the city who had taught herself to listen to lightning. It could move a needle without touching it. It could make a bell ring across the room by persuading the air to carry a ghost of force. The woman had written notes as clean as a psalm and drawn figures so patient you wanted to apologize for your own handwriting. The boys said she had asked for an audience. She wanted help publishing her work so that the church would not fear it. She thinks it can heal the wounded nerves of soldiers, he said. We stood around the device as if it were a newborn, and we were deciding whether to call it miracle or threat. The friar from the coil room entered, wiped his hands, and nodded with professional envy. It works, he said. It will frighten men who believe God's hand contains only warmth. He looked to the custos. What shall we name it? The custos looked at me. You have been copying and pulling and shifting and learning to inhale around knives, she said. Name it. My mouth dried. A dozen names assembled, wearing new clothes. Induction would carry it into laboratories, where fear hoards fuses. Angel would carry it into churches where grief needs something to kiss. Heresy would carry it into prisons, where truth learns to sleep with one eye open. I remembered the headmistress's chalkboard, questions that build, questions that erode. The boy watched me with the honesty of someone who has not yet been paid to lie. Call it an answer, I said at last, to a question God asked long ago and left on the table. The room waited. Publish her notes, I said to the friar. Print them in the journal, that the men who fear their hands will nevertheless read in secret. Above ground, I turned to the custos. We will bless its use in hospitals, as a parable for steady hands, as a reminder that healing prefers patience to fire. We will neither make it a demon nor an angel. We will refuse to be dramatic. The Monsignor's face softened. The custos's eyes became, for a breath, almost kind. You have chosen a narrow bridge, she said. Walk it carefully. We left the device sleeping in its box. The boy carried it out with the tenderness of a brother. Outside the small chamber, the cabinet of masks shone. I knew now which I would wear. Charitable interpretation, necessary delay, reasonable doubt. They were not lies if worn faithfully. They were the patient clothes of men who try to keep the city from drowning in its own clarity. We were done, I thought, but the ministry had one more room, small, windowless, lit by a single lamp that looked both ancient and newly plugged in. On a table lay a book bound in two colors, half white, half black. The spine read, Manual of Reconciliation Between Fact and Hope. The custos opened it to a page marked with a ribbon the color of ash. There, in handwriting that had learned to be elegant by confessing its impatience, I read the rule of the ministry. Let the world be true in private and merciful in public. Let art teach without shouting. Let science heal without bragging. Let education ask its questions in the order that keeps children from falling. Where a fact wounds a hope, bandage the hope without breaking the fact. Where a hope demands a lie, feed it a story that tastes like honesty and is over a long enough year indistinguishable from obedience. The custos closed the book. We are not villains, she said. We are plumbers and tailors. The soul leaks. The century changes size. She looked older then, and not in the way stone is old. In the way bread is old, having done its work, having asked to be forgiven for how it fed men who then used their strength to break something better. When I stepped back into the corridor, the infrastructure of fear hung patient on its pins. I touched the violin string. It hummed an A that had learned monotony to avoid seducing anyone into music. I wanted to snap it and listen for rebellion. Instead, I leaned my head against the panel labeled Silence and felt the wood remember all the foreheads that had come here before mine. The Monsignor spoke from behind me. "You can still leave," he said. "You can go upstairs and spend a life among ordinary hours. You will forget enough to survive. You will remember enough to be unhappy in beautiful rooms." The custos did not turn. "Or," she said, "you can carry." Her voice was not command, but weather. "Carry until the carrying teaches you why the bridge has to exist." I did not answer them. I answered the stair when it rose to meet my foot. I answered the rope in the clock room when it leaned into my palm. I answered the boy by sending a note that told him where to deliver the woman's paper, and another note that told the headmistress which classroom might begin, with a question that erodes and then carefully repair the erosion with something like love. On the square that night, Rome smelled of bread and diesel and too many prayers trying to happen at once. I stood among them, like a nail that had been hammered in the wrong place and left because removing it would ruin the door. Above me, the sky practiced its old miracle of forgiveness. I watched and felt no forgiveness come, and did not know whether this meant I had become useful or lost. Listen to me now. The ministry is not monstrous because it hates truth. It is monstrous because it loves peace in a way that asks truth to wear a smaller coat. It polishes knives and calls them spoons. It trains bells to skip a beat and calls it mercy. It takes science by the hand and asks it to speak softly, then teaches art to lower its eyes, then schools children to find the answers that keep the floor clean. This is how a city remains lucid enough to function and dim enough not to revolt. This is the ultimate control, a net made of 1,000 small forgivings. Tomorrow, I will break the net. Not because I hate the men and women within it, they are kinder than the word control allows. I will break it because my memory has begun to speak without asking permission. Because the pit with the 12 chairs listens at night. Because a boy carried a box with a device the world deserves to know without translation. Because saints unmade do not stop shining. Because popes borrowed become bridges you cannot cross forever. Because time, however we trim it, grows back like hair. Tomorrow I will say it plainly. Tomorrow I will ask you to join me. Tomorrow the confession becomes a hand on your shoulder. I will tell you what I was taught never to pronounce. Do not stop asking. Do not stop remembering. The most dangerous thing for them is when memory returns. I will not make you walk another corridor before I ask you to decide. You have followed me beneath doors that do not open for sunlight. You have listened while the wheel breathed and the bell forgot a minute. You have watched statues learn humility and miracles learn grammar. You know now what the labyrinth keeps and what it rearranges. The question remaining is the only question worth the bruise of breath. What will you do with your memory now that it has begun to wake? I left the ministry before dawn, the square still wearing the shawl of night. The fountains murmured their old arithmetic. Pigeons practiced their profession of forgiveness. A street sweeper conducted his bristles as if leading a small choir that never auditions. I stood beside the obelisk and counted the faces that would never know the labyrinth had counted them first. Then I turned not up, not down, but in and began the last descent I will ever make, alone. The iron door knew me. It tolerated my hand the way old doors tolerate the palms of men who have become keys by accident. The stair measured me and found me acceptable with reluctance. Below, the corridors held the night as a bowl holds quiet water. "I have come," I said aloud, and my voice did not echo, it nested. The labyrinth remembers. But tonight, I made a second request. Remember me in a way that can be passed to others. I walked the path that had trained my feet, the antechamber of dust, where chained books stirred as if they could smell goodbye, the corridor of black glass, where reflections that were not mine paused at corners like cousins deciding whether to embrace. The circular room with the 12 chairs and the pit that listens better than any confessor. I did not sit. I did not pray. I stood with my toes at the lip and spoke to what I once feared was absence. "I will give you a life," I said, "but not the way you taught us. I will give you this life, the one I have left above, the one spent among ordinary hours. I will make my memory public. I will break the small net. You may keep my silence, if you require a price. I will not be needing it." A sound rose from the pit that was not wind and not word. It was the noise a sealed letter makes in the mind of the man who has decided at last to read it. I returned to the gallery of almost. The half-faced woman regarded me without urgency. The fabricated pontiff stood like a bridge that knows storms by their first taste of air. I touched neither. They had their work, and I had mine. In the studio of reverence, a novice slept with his cheek on a velvet pouch of dust. I lifted his head and left him dreaming of lighter crowns. In the ministry, the cabinet of masks waited. I opened it and chose 3. Charitable interpretation, for those who will require a gentler door. Reasonable doubt, for those who will not enter any door without measuring it first. Emergency rubric, for the hour when the city confuses love with fire. I did not steal them. I borrowed them the way men borrow tools to repair their neighbor's roof before rain. On a table I placed what I would carry to the world above, a copy of the sentence that had chosen me. If memory cannot be forbidden, it can be distracted. A schedule of bells, with their rehearsed omissions marked in the margin. A page from the Manual of Reconciliation between Fact and Hope, with its ribbon deliberately mislaid. A small vial from the Sister Apothecary, labeled only Gratitude. The iron ring from the Archivum Subrosa I did not take. I no longer needed to look like I carried weight. I intended to carry it. At the grate above the deeper stair, I stopped. "Not for the living," the Monsignor had said, "but this is the trick of confessions. When spoken aloud, they raise the dead." I placed my palm against the iron flower that had refused me, and felt it remain loyal to its gardener. "Keep what must be kept," I told it. "Open what must be opened. Teach patience to the hurried and unease to the content. Do not let time forget what we did to it." I climbed, then, not as a priest, not as an archivist, not as a traitor, but as a courier of a very old message, dressed in shoes that could survive streets. Before the iron door shut, I turned and bowed, not to authority, not to terror, but to the stones. They do not lie. They only remember what we ask them to hold. And now I am here, with you, and there is no corridor left to postpone the essential labor. This is the part of the documentary where the camera steps back and the room widens, and the narrator, whose voice you have begun to recognize as the echo of your own, says the quiet sentence out loud. Do not stop asking. Do not stop remembering. Ask the calendar why it apologizes for some Octobers and not others. Ask the bell whether it missed a note or was trained to. Ask a statue whether its face has always been the face it wears at weddings. Ask the ledger whether a saint retired from war to kitchens and hospital wards, and whether you might visit him there with an armful of ordinary kindness. Ask the syllabus which questions build and which erode, and why erosion frightens men who are afraid of rivers. Remember the names that drift. Fish them from the bath of names and pronounce them in kitchens and bus stops until they stop being weapons and start being neighbors. Remember that science learns humility when it is loved, not when it is leashed. Remember that art stands up straighter when you let it look you in the eyes without telling it which emotion you came to purchase. Remember that children will ask why 3 times, and that on the 4th they are asking to be trusted. The labyrinth will not burn if you speak. It was built from materials that do not fear flame. What burns, when memory returns, is the habit of looking away. Fire, in this case, is not a destroyer. It is a light switch. I can already hear the counsels you will be offered by the careful. Be prudent, be patient, be polite with your truths. They are not wrong. Prudence is a bridge. Patience keeps the nails honest. Politeness is a way to carry the fragile without dropping it. Wear the masks when they keep neighbors from choking on dust, but do not make a home of them. The true face must breathe, or it forgets how to resemble you. Perhaps you are waiting for the part where I instruct you precisely write to this office, refuse that ceremony, unscrew that bell. I cannot. The labyrinth taught me the arrogance of prescriptions. It taught me, too, the intimacy of suggestions. So I will suggest this. Begin small and near. Choose 1 hour on the calendar you suspect was moved, and sit with it until it tells you whom it belongs to. Make a call. Bring a chair. Restore the minute the bell skipped by listening longer than conversation requires. Choose 1 image whose face has grown too severe. Stand before it and imagine it softer by the width of a single breath. Then live that breath when you leave the building. Choose 1 child and ask not, "What did you learn?" but "What did you wonder?" When they answer, resist the urge to file their wonder into a cabinet you already trust. Choose 1 saint whose name has become a slogan. Walk his story back down to kitchen height, to hospital light height, to the room where wrists are washed and bread is divided. If you cannot locate him there, let him rest. Choose 1 miracle that might be mercy wearing an apron. Thank the apron. Do not argue with the miracle. Gratitude is a technology older than doubt, and when you are ready, do the unfashionable work of forming a circle that is not a conspiracy. 3 people is enough. 5 is perfect. You will meet without minutes. You will each bring a page copied, not stolen, of something the world forgot to know it had forgotten. You will read aloud. You will ask the questions that erode and then build again, because construction without demolition is a lie, and demolition without tenderness is a sport. You will take turns wearing the mask called charitable interpretation, so no one drowns in corrective joy. You will teach one another how to keep memory from being distracted. What of danger? Yes. The ministry is plumbing because panic smells worse than truth. Pipes groan when pressure rises. You may be accused of melodrama by those who have learned to call anesthesia peace. You may be asked to apologize for clarity. When that happens, remember the ring of iron, plain as bread. Remember the rope that warmed to centuries of hands. Remember that the most dangerous thing for them was never your anger, it was your recall. I give you one last scene to keep in your pocket for nights when sleep refuses to be persuaded. A boy once carried a box into a room where men were deciding whether to name the future a demon or a hymn. Inside the box, lightning had learned to whisper instead of shout. They asked me to choose. I chose a bridge. It was narrow. It demanded the balance of a man who cannot afford the luxury of scenery. The boy crossed. The city followed more slowly. Because cities are heavy, the device did what it promised. Some soldiers slept without trembling. Some bells learned to ring with mercy. Some doctors wrote notes that smelled faintly of altar wine, because gratitude has a way of perfuming paperwork. That bridge is yours now. Not because I built it, I did not, but because you already carry it in your mouth. Your words can close doors or teach them to be hinges. Your memory can be a knife or a thread. Choose thread when you can. Choose knife only when the room has mistaken a throat for a lock. You are waiting for the last line, the one you can write on a card and tape to a mirror and pretend you have lived by it all your life. I will not disappoint you. It is not mine. I stole it from the part of you that remembered before you were taught to forget. Do not stop asking. Do not stop remembering. The most dangerous thing for them is when memory returns. If you repeat it aloud, say it in a voice that sounds like you speaking to someone you love in a kitchen crowded with ordinary light. If you whisper it to the calendar. It listens. If you shout it, shout not at men but at the habit of looking away. This is the end of the confession and the beginning of the work. The labyrinth, under the Vatican, will continue to be stone and blood and memory carved into the earth. I wish it mercy. I wish it witnesses brave enough to measure mercy by how much it returns to kitchens. I wish you courage gentle enough to look like patience and stubborn enough to embarrass a lie. When your hour comes, and it will, you will stand beside an ordinary door and feel the breath of a room that does not announce its source. You will press your fingers to the small brass circle. It will warm beneath your touch. You will want to blink. Try not to. The room prefers the undistracted. Go. Carry. Return the minute the bell skipped. Restore the face that can feed children. Lift the year without letting it bruise the month. Break the net with tenderness. And when you are asked by a child, by a friend, by a stranger with a box what to name the future, say, an answer to a question God asked long ago and left on the table, and then set the table. I am finished. Keep the light.